There it is. Okay, so come on in, ladies. Have a seat. So good morning and welcome. I'm Kathy Ridge, and I'm going to be teaching this morning on chapter 19, verses 1 through 27 in the Gospel of John. And I want to say hello, too, to all our online friends. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, we're glad that you're joining us, too. So, hey. And I always want to put up our admin's email address because I want you to be able to connect with us if you're out there somewhere in the world, not here in person with us. So you can always email Darlene at this email address if you have questions or comments, or if you just want to let us know that you're watching. And speaking of comments, I guess you can also comment on Facebook or YouTube, so we know you're here. We just like to know you're out there. We see the numbers, but we don't get to connect them with faces or names. So we'd like just to know. So last week, Janice taught for me, and I just wanted to thank her. Thank you, Janice. That was excellent teaching. Really, really grateful. I was telling the leadership earlier that I feel like I have a really deep bench on my leadership team that I can pull from. So I'm blessed that way. I want to tell you, too, that next week we're going to pre-register for Genesis, which is our study for next year. It's not really next year, it's the fall. So I call it next year because it's our next study year. You'll be doing that in your small groups next week. So we're going to have some registration cards for you to fill out if you're planning on coming back for Genesis. I'm also going to have registration cards available to you if you know somebody who wants to come next year for sure. Even not for sure, but if they think they might want to come, they could go ahead and fill one out and give it back to you to bring here, because it's just really helpful for us to know how many to sort of expect getting started for next year. So that's what that's all about, is just maybe giving us an idea for next year of what numbers we can expect, so we have enough leadership to accommodate everyone. The other thing, on Friday at 6:30 of this week, this coming Friday, so the 23rd, is that right? The Connect Women's Ministry, which is of what we are a part of here, is going to have a social here at the church, and I wanted to make sure you knew about that. If you want to come, everyone here is welcome. You don't have to be a member of this church to attend. You can come and bring friends. It's really just a fun thing. Come and, eat desserts and snacks, visit with women. There's some games you can participate in if you want to. You don't have to. It's just 2 hours of fellowship. So that's Friday night. And then one last thing for you before I start. On May 11th, which is our last class day, we're going to have a fellowship after class for the whole class. Everybody will come, and that'll probably be a potluck. I'll give you some more information on that as we get closer, but I wanted to just put that on your radar so you would know it's coming. Okay, so before we get going, let's open with a word of prayer. Lord, we're about to enter into some of the most sacred text in your word, and I just ask that you would protect it from any wrong teaching or personal interpretation that distracts us or turns our eyes away from the magnitude of the gift that you've given to us. And I ask that our hearts would be filleted open by our understanding of the depth of your love, that you would go to the cross, the terrible and the beautiful cross for us. Lord, I ask that you would speak through me, through your Holy Spirit, because I'm just a mere woman and I'm not qualified to teach on this text. Only you can do that. So let it be your words. And I ask in Jesus' holy name. Amen. All right, so how many of you like true crime shows? Put your hand up. See? Dateline, Forensic Files, right? Or maybe you enjoy books about real-life mysteries. Does the unsolved murder of John Benet Ramsey, or maybe the never-caught bank robber D.B. Cooper, do those intrigue you? Kind of want to know what happened there? what is it about true mysteries that we're so drawn to? I think it's that we just want to know what really happened. We want to uncover the truth, because whether we realize it or not, whether we admit it or not, the truth matters. Deep down, we all know that truth matters. Deep down, our hearts long for truth. But the thing is, we live in a world now that doesn't differentiate between truth and belief. And that's kind of a problem, because truth corresponds with reality, but beliefs may or may not match reality. In our world today, what we believe becomes our truth, whether it's based in reality or not. Our beliefs are formed by our background and our culture and our experiences. And if those factors in someone's life lead them to believe, say, that dogs are good pets and cats are horrible pets, that becomes their truth, their reality. Because they believe it, it becomes fact for them. But someone else might disagree. Dogs are terrible pets and cats are the best. That's me, by the way. That's equally true, because it's what they believe. If you believe it, it's true for you. If you don't believe it, it's not true for you. That's called relative truth. And relative truth says that there is no absolute truth, that truth is always relative to what you believe. And it's absurd, really, in many ways, because, of course, not all truth is relative. Any sane person would agree that it's an absolute truth that the sun rises every day. They would never say that's dependent on what people believe about the sun. The reality is that the sun does rise every day, whether people believe it or not. It's the truth. Truth is grounded in reality. It's the way things really are. Relative truth is based on opinion. Relative truth is a popular philosophy in our culture today, and it's really becoming the accepted way to think about truth. But the Bible teaches that truth is not relative. It teaches that truth is unchanging. It doesn't slide around with trends that are popular to the culture. God says, I, the Lord, do not change. And he says that truth is rock solid. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. He says his truth is eternal. All your words are true. All your righteous laws are eternal. See, there's no such thing as a new truth. If it's new, it's not true. And if it's true, it's not new. All truth has been around for eternity. We may newly discover for ourselves or newly apply it or have it newly revealed to us, but there's no such thing as a new truth. Truth is eternal and it's absolute. It's not influenced by personal feelings or beliefs or opinions. It's impartial, unbiased, and unprejudiced. Pontius Pilate cynically asked in last week's lesson, what is truth? When he was trying to decide what to do with Jesus and those furious Jews that were on his doorstep, he didn't know what the real truth of the matter was, and he didn't know how to figure it out because he didn't understand truth. He thought truth depended on the situation. He thought it was relative. He thought it depended on all kinds of different factors, the political implications, and how it would affect his personal power base and what the reaction of the crowd might be. He had no standard to hold his decision up against, nothing to compare against to determine right from wrong. His truth was based on his personal opinions and his personal feelings and his personal agenda. But Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. See, he didn't say he would show the truth. He didn't say he would teach the truth or model the truth. He said he is the truth, the eternal, perfect, absolute truth. He is truth personified. He is the source of all truth, the manifestation of all truth. He's the immovable reference point for all truth claims. He doesn't change to conform to our desires and our feelings and our beliefs. We may try to change his truth to fit our agenda. In fact, that happens all the time. It says in 2 Timothy, that the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they'll gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They'll turn their ears away from truth and turn aside to myths. But when that happens, it only hurts us. It doesn't change him. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. He's the truth. No matter what we think, no matter what we believe, no matter how much we might wish otherwise, just like the sun rises every day, whether people believe it or not, Jesus is the unchanging truth of God, whether people believe it or not. So let's take a look at the first half of chapter 19 here today, and so we can find out what it says about his truth. We left last week with Jesus standing before Pilate, who offered to release Jesus as part of the Roman custom of releasing a Jewish prisoner at Passover. And you remember that the crowd shouted, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas instead." So as we begin in chapter 19, we pick up the story right there. In response to the crowd's rejection of Pilate's offer to let Jesus go, and at their insistence that he be charged, Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. To be flogged means to be beaten with a whip or a stick as a form of punishment, but the Romans had a special form of flogging, or scourging as it's called in some of your translations. They used an instrument called a flagellum, which was much different than a bullwhip, which is what you might picture when you think of a whip. A flagellum was a whip with several strands about 3 feet long and weighted on the ends with pieces of lead or bone. It was designed to break open the skin rather than just leave bruises or welts. The victim was bound to a post or a frame with his skin exposed and whipped across the torso. It was meant to be horrifically painful. And though it wasn't normally used as a means of execution, the victim often did die from shock and blood loss as their back was laid open, even to the point of exposing internal organs. It was considered so heinous a punishment that Roman citizens were exempt from it. It was only used on slaves and non-Romans. Despite the severity of the sentence that Pilate gave Jesus, the order to flog him, there's some indication that Pilate may have been trying to help Jesus by giving that order. It says in Mark's gospel that Pilate was trying to satisfy the crowd. And remember, he'd said, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." And as he was possibly hoping that the crowd would be satisfied with the brutal flogging rather than a full death sentence. The very public aspect of the punishment was meant to demean and to humiliate. But in Jesus' case, the Romans there took it a step further. After the flogging, they took him into the courtyard of the governor's palace. The whole company of soldiers there gathered around him, and they stripped him and formed a crown out of the thorny vines from that region, which have long and hard and very sharp thorns. And they pushed it onto his head, piercing his scalp and inflicting even more pain. From somewhere they produced a purple robe, the color of royalty, and put it on him. Matthew's gospel tells us that they put a staff in his right hand. And then they went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, the King of the Jews." And they hit him on the head and on the crown of thorns, and they spat on him. It's a scene that sickens us. It makes us cringe. This celebration of evil just jumps right off the page. We can feel it. The soldiers are engaged in a sadistic kind of revelry, a frenzy of gleeful cruelty and wickedness. Verse 3 says they repeated their mockery and their abuse over and over again as Jesus stood there with his back torn open and thorns lacerating, blood running freely down his face and body. When Pilate observed all this, and then he went out to the Jews again, Jews who were too pious, mind you, to step foot on the governor's palace because they didn't want to be considered unclean. And he said to them, I'm going to bring him back out to you because I find no basis for a charge against him. If I had, I would have ordered his execution. And he brought Jesus out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Here he is, Pilate said. He invited them to see Jesus' suffering, to see what had been done to a man that Pilate considered innocent. It's possible that he hoped that the sight of Jesus, bleeding and humiliated with spit all over his face, would finally satisfy the rage of the Jews. But no, they had no pity, no compassion. As soon as they saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" It was a scream of rage and hatred. It was them shaking their fist at God. It was the inner malice and hostility that mankind feels toward God being outwardly displayed. It was the inner condition of their heart being played out in their words and their actions. Crucify! Crucify! It's horrifying for us, those of us who know and love God, who understand his character and have experienced his love and his grace and his mercy. But they didn't know God, and neither did we at one point. And that's exactly why Jesus endured such abuse, why he walked toward it instead of away from it. He did it for them. He did it for us, so that we could know him. So the Jews wanted to crucify Jesus, but Pilate was still trying to escape the responsibility of ordering his execution. He said, "You take him and crucify him. I don't think he's guilty." He would have known, of course, that they couldn't take Jesus and crucify him. As Jews, they didn't have the authority to put someone to death. Only the Romans could do that. So once more, Pilate was trying to spare Jesus' life. But the Jews, who definitely wanted Jesus' death, petitioned Pilate to carry out the sentence that their laws required. They insisted Jesus must die, and only Pilate could carry out that sentence. They said Jesus had to die because he had blasphemed by claiming to be the Son of God. So this was their true charge against Jesus. Earlier, they had accused him before Pilate of trying to overthrow the Romans and opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar and claiming to be a king. They said he stirred up the people all over Judea and Galilee with his teaching. But now they revealed their true accusation against Jesus. He claimed to be God. However, their argument almost backfired. Pilate, when he heard what Jesus had claimed, was frightened. He didn't scoff, he didn't laugh, he was afraid, which shows us that he didn't see Jesus the same way he saw other prisoners, as some pathetic, broken man, someone who had control and dominance over. He saw something else in Jesus. Despite Jesus' beaten and bloody condition, Pilate saw something in him that made him fearful that Jesus' claims might be true. And I don't think we can assume that Pilate knew or understood God, but any person of that time would have been very familiar with the idea of gods and the children of gods, who might have the appearance of a man but had supernatural power and ability. And here Pilate was, standing in the presence of someone who made the claim to be the Son of God and had a presence about him that made that seem possible. And so he was afraid. He went back inside the palace again to question Jesus about this new information. He said, "Tell me where you come from." He wasn't asking if Jesus was from Galilee or from Judea or some other place. He wanted to know if Jesus came from the gods. Where do you come from? But Jesus gave no answer. He'd already told Pilate that his kingdom was not of this world. And so he'd already answered the question. And Pilate had dismissed it. And we don't know why Jesus stayed silent, but the most likely reason is that Pilate would not or could not receive the truth of it. And so Jesus didn't repeat himself. But one thing we do know is that Jesus' silence was in full alignment with the will of the Father. 750 years earlier, God's prophet Isaiah had written these words, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." Centuries before Jesus stood in front of Pilate, Isaiah saw that he would not speak. Jesus' silence amazed Pilate. "Are you kidding? You're refusing to speak to me? Don't you know I have the power to either free you or crucify you?" And this was a question Jesus did choose to answer. Pilate believed he had full control over the situation and full control over Jesus' fate. And so Jesus corrected him. He said, "You have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." And this wasn't bravado or bluster from Jesus. It was a truth statement. God is sovereign over all things, and whatever power Pilate had in this situation had been granted to him by God. He only had it because Jesus willingly submitted to it in order to carry out his purposes. Pilate wielded power over Jesus because God ordained it, because Jesus allowed it. And Jesus went on to say, "Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." See, Pilate had no knowledge of the truth. He hadn't had the exposure to Jesus' teaching that the Jewish leaders had been given. His sin was lesser because his ability to understand truth was lesser. But he was guilty of sin. He used the power he had to convict Jesus, despite the fact that all of his instincts were telling him that Jesus was innocent. He recognized the truth of that just from being in Jesus' presence. The Jewish leaders, on the other hand, had heard the truth, had listened to Jesus, had seen his miracles. They had up close and personal interaction with him. And after all that, they rejected the truth. They used their power as representatives of God to orchestrate the premeditated murder of Jesus. They were guilty of greater sin. After this conversation with Jesus, Pilate was fully convinced that Jesus was innocent of the charges against him. And there's a sense of panic around him now. In verse 12, it says he tried some unknown number of times to convince the Jews to allow him to set Jesus free. He knew it should happen, but the Jews kept up their pressure. They knew Pilate's primary responsibility as governor was to keep the peace in Jerusalem. That was Rome's highest priority, that there would be peace and order in their provinces. They came down hard and with great brutality on any kind of uprisings. Pilate was in charge of keeping that peace. And right now, he had a screaming mob outside his palace that could easily, at a moment's notice, spark into a riot. To lose control of it would certainly have jeopardized his position. So when Jesus began throwing out accusations that he was against Caesar, it broke down the last of his resistance. He brought Jesus before him as he sat on a seat raised high up above the court, and he offered his final judgment. He was tired of the fight, tired of the responsibility, tired of the Jews and their unreasonable demands. He told them with irony and sarcasm, "Here is your king." And he presented Jesus to them, bloodied and beaten, with the crown of thorns on his head and wearing a blood-soaked purple robe. And when they saw him, the crowd erupted, spewing hatred and venom, screaming, "Take him away, crucify him." Pilate asked, this time with contempt, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." In one last and final rejection of truth, they gave their allegiance to Rome rather than to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And Pilate handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. Pilate felt Jesus' power and saw his dignity. He knew in his heart that Jesus was innocent. He tried at least 7 times to free him. He even washed his hands in front of the crowd and announced, "I am innocent of this man's blood." He did that because he knew the truth. But in the end, he caved. He compromised. His sin escalated as he failed to hold firmly to truth. He ended up sending the God of the universe to his death. And the Jewish leaders, the members of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees who stood in the crowd and shouted for Jesus' death, they took the truth of God and they twisted it and perverted it into something that served their hatred and rage. They compromised it to a point that it was unrecognizable. Their sin was even greater. And it leads to our first truth. Compromising the truth of Jesus Christ leads to greater sin. Compromising the truth of Jesus Christ leads to greater sin. To compromise means to give something up in order to get something. So it's a necessary thing to keep relationships running smoothly. It's certainly an important factor in marriage and in friendship and between colleagues at work and in diplomacy and in just about every other form of relationship. It's the lubricant that keeps the wheels of society rolling. There's not a thing wrong with compromise. It's a good and necessary thing, unless you're talking about it in the context of truth. You can't compromise when it comes to truth, because once you compromise it, it isn't truth anymore. Think about this. If it's true that 2 + 2 = 4, it can never equal anything but 4. If someone decides that 2 + 2 actually equals 6, and another person insists that no, it's 4, they both can't be right. Either one is right and one is wrong, or they're both wrong. But they can't both be right. If they decide to compromise and agree that 2 + 2 = 5, they can say that, but it doesn't make it true. The reality is that 2 + 2 does indeed equal 4, no matter what agreement they came to. But what if they were able to convince the whole world that 2 + 2 does equal 5? Well, then it would become an accepted truth, but it still wouldn't be the actual truth. 2 + 2 will always, in actual truth, equal 4. Abraham Lincoln made a famous comment to some of his cabinet members. He said, if you count the tail of your cow as a leg, well, how many legs would the cow have? They all promptly replied, 5. And he said, no, calling the tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. The cow still has 4 legs. See, actual truth can't be compromised. It stands unchanged no matter what we believe. And that applies to the truth of Jesus Christ, because his truth is actual truth. It's absolute truth. Anything that isn't his truth is a lie. So to compromise God's truth is to create a lie. You can't give a little to get a little with God's truth. Once you compromise it, it's not truth anymore. The world tells us as Christians that we need to be more tolerant, more open to new ideas. It says we have to be more culturally sensitive and relevant and accepting. The world says that we're becoming obsolete and out of date, and we need to make some changes, be more inclusive. You know what all that is? It's compromise. It's the world saying, change your truth so that it's acceptable to us. And as soon as we do that, as soon as we compromise what God tells us is truth, it becomes a lie. But all of those things sound good and right to us. We all want to be culturally sensitive and relevant and accepting. We want to include everyone. But we can't do that at the expense of the truth, because the world needs the truth. It's the truth that will set them free from the bondage of sin and death. If we compromise that truth, we're giving them a lie. They might find that lie palatable and sweet to the taste, but it's empty. It has no power. Only the truth has the power to save. A compromised truth will lead them into greater sin because it's a lie. But don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that we should use truth like a hammer. Far from it. We speak in love, always in love. We cover everything in love. But love isn't the same thing as compromise. It isn't loving to leave a person in their sin in the name of being inclusive. It's not loving to leave them enslaved to sin by telling them that their sin is acceptable. It's not loving to strip truth of its power and feed it to someone as a lie. We can't compromise God's truth. The minute we do, we are of no use to the kingdom because we're perpetrating lies. I remember watching a season of the reality show Survivor a long time ago. You guys know that show? In the opening episode of this particular season, when the contestants arrived in the country where it was going to be filmed, and before they traveled to the island where they were going to be marooned, they were all taken to a Buddhist temple. They were supposed to go inside and kneel at the altar and get what they were told was a non-religious blessing from the monk. One of the contestants was a Christian, and she refused to do it. The host of the show came down hard on her. He told her it would be an insult to the temple and to the country, and that she could lose her place on the show for disrespecting the culture. But she stood firm. She told him very respectfully that her Christian faith would not allow her to bow at the altar of a false god, and she walked out. I still remember that one scene of a show that aired probably 15 years ago. And I can't tell you anything else about that season of Survivor, but I remember that. She refused to compromise the truth, and she made a huge impact on me and on who knows how many others who were viewing. But what if she'd compromised? She would have sent a completely different message to the watching world. She would have perpetrated a lie, that it's okay to break the 10 Commandments in certain situations. Her faith would have been affected, her testimony would have been damaged, and her witness would have been false. Compromising the truth of Jesus Christ leads to greater sin. So let's go now to the next section. It's verses 17 through 27. When the soldiers took charge of Jesus, they followed the Roman custom of having him carry his own cross. The idea behind the custom was to draw attention to the condemned man. It was essentially a walk of shame. But Jesus was weakened by the flogging he'd received. He'd been bleeding freely for a long time, so blood loss was a factor, and his body was in shock, and he was exhausted. And the distance from Pilate's palace to Golgotha, where the crucifixions took place, was about a third of a mile. And the estimate of how much that heavy beam weighed was somewhere between 80 and 110 pounds. And Jesus wasn't able to carry it. So the soldiers seized a man named Simon from Cyrene, who was passing by, and they put the crossbeam on his back, and they forced him to carry it behind Jesus as they walked out of the city. Crucifixion was a practice that originated with the Persians, but the Romans are the ones who perfected it. They used it to execute slaves and non-Romans and the worst kind of criminals, but not Roman citizens. A Roman citizen sentenced to death would never hang on a cross. Crucifixion caused tremendous pain and suffering and a long, lingering death. When sentenced to die this way, the victim was laid on the short part of the cross beam, and while it was still laying on the ground, and the arms were stretched out, and large nails, about 7 inches long, were driven into the hands or the wrists. And then the crossbeam was lifted up and attached to the long part of the cross, which was already upright in the ground. And once hanging on the cross, the person's feet were placed together and nails were driven into both feet. This is what happened to Jesus. And the Gospels don't go into any depth at all about the details of Jesus' suffering. John says he was flogged, and he leaves it at that. And he says they crucified him, but he offers no details about what that entails. I wonder if even many years later, John couldn't bear to remember the horror of those last hours of Jesus' life. Or maybe it's because there's just no words. The Roman statesman Cicero said this about crucifixion: "It's an act so abominable that it's impossible to find any word to adequately express." The 2 other men were crucified with Jesus, both of them criminals, and they were positioned on either side of him. Barabbas was supposed to be crucified that day also, but Jesus took his place. And isn't that a powerful illustration of what he did for all of us? He took our place. He died so we could live. Pilate had a sign that read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This sign was called a titulus, and it told the person's name and what the offense was that they were being punished for. It was hung over the heads of the crucified for everyone to see, so they would know what crime had been committed. So Pilate's charge against Jesus was that he claimed to be the King of the Jews. He knew that wasn't true. He knew that, in fact, Jesus had denied that claim. But he couldn't justify a crucifixion based on Jesus saying he was the Son of God. By Roman standards, that wasn't a capital offense. So he used the original charge made against Jesus. But here's the thing. Jesus is the King of the Jews. He's the King of us all. He's the King of kings and the Lord of lords. So despite what Pilate intended with his sign, he told the truth. It was a truth statement made to the world about who Jesus Christ of Nazareth is. Crucifixions were public events. The Romans wanted it that way so that they would serve as cautionary tales, warnings about what would happen if you committed a crime against Rome. And so the crucifixions happened in a place where they could easily be seen from the road by travelers and passersby. And Pilate, knowing the diverse crowd that was in Jerusalem for Passover, had the sign written in the three main languages of the region: Aramaic for the local Jewish population, Latin for the Romans, and Greek for those who came into the city from areas around the Mediterranean. Well, the chief priests protested. Don't say he is the King of the Jews. Say he claimed to be the King of the Jews. They didn't like this truth statement. They wanted to twist it, to compromise it. But Pilate wouldn't be swayed, and he wouldn't change the sign. What I've written is what I've written. Do you know why? Because the truth of Jesus Christ always prevails. For 2,000 years, that sign has stood as a testimony to the true identity of Jesus Christ, a truth recorded in God's word for all of us to see and know. He didn't claim to be king. He is our king. There's a lot of things recorded in the other three Gospels that happened while Jesus hung on the cross. He was mocked by the chief priests. They said, he calls himself the Christ, then let him come down from the cross. Let God rescue him. The soldiers mocked him too. Aren't you the King of the Jews? If so, then save yourself. One of the men hanging next to him hurled insults at him and said, aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and save us. But the other man recognized truth. He saw that Jesus was God himself. This man said to the other, don't you fear God? And to Jesus he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus told him, I tell you the truth. Today you'll be with me in paradise. John tells us about the soldiers who took Jesus' clothing and divided it among themselves, splitting it between them 4 ways. There was one piece left over, a tunic, considered an undergarment, that was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. The soldiers decided that they would rather keep it whole instead of tearing it, and so they cast lots to see who would get it. This fulfilled messianic prophecy from Psalm 22. They divided my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Words that were written 600 years before these soldiers sat laughing and mocking and playing games of chance at the foot of the cross. John also gives us detail not found in any of the other Gospels, something that must have been very personal for him. He was at the cross with Jesus, standing near Jesus' mother, Mary. And I can't even begin to imagine the agony that Mary was experiencing. When she and Joseph brought Jesus as a baby to the temple to be dedicated, Simeon, a righteous and devout man of God, took Jesus in his arms and blessed him. But he said to Mary that a sword would pierce her soul. I'm certain that as she stood under that cross with her precious son, her boy, hanging on it, that her soul was pierced. When Jesus saw that John was there, he consciously made a point to make arrangements for his mother's care. He appointed John as her caretaker, to bring her into his own home and treat her as his own mother. And it's a somewhat surprising command, actually, because Mary had other children besides Jesus, and typically they would have cared for her. But perhaps it was because at that point, Jesus' siblings didn't yet believe, and he had wanted her to be among the faithful. Even in the midst of his own profound suffering and sacrifice, he was caring for others. And next week, it's that sacrifice that we're going to talk about. But this week was all about truth. What it is, who it is, what it becomes when it's compromised. And this last section illustrates how it always stands unshakable, unchangeable, no matter how man tries to stifle it. Pilate wrote what he wrote, and he refused to change it. And by doing so, he inadvertently made a truth statement in the midst of the most wicked and evil act in the history of the world. Our truth for this section is the truth of Jesus Christ always prevails. The truth of Jesus Christ always prevails. Do you know what the United States' national motto is? Don't be shy. There you go. In God we trust. That wasn't very hard. So here's a harder one. What's the national motto for the Czech Republic? There's crickets out there. And I know you're thinking, why would we possibly know that? And it's true, unless you're Czech, you probably wouldn't. But I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the truth I just gave you. Czechia's national motto is truth prevails. It traces back to a priest named Jan Hus, who lived in Prague in the late 14th century. At the time, Europe was in the middle of the Black Plague, and it wasn't a prosperous time at all. People were living in fear and great poverty. Around that time, the church in Rome began selling what are called indulgences. For a price, a penitent person could purchase a ticket that would reduce the amount of punishment they would receive for their sins. In other words, the church was teaching that a person could pay money to make their sin seem less severe. Well, Jan Hus was outraged by this, feeling that the church was greedy and dishonest and taking advantage of the poor. His criticism of the church eventually led to his arrest, and he was burned at the stake. And as the flames rose around him, he shouted in defiance of their warped and compromised teaching, "Truth prevails." And 605 years later, his message still rings true. The truth always wins. Despite corruption and manipulation and compromise and flat-out attempts to destroy it, despite every human effort, the truth of Jesus Christ always prevails. 3 times in chapter 12 of the book of Mark, the religious leaders tried to catch Jesus up in his words so they could discredit him, find something blasphemous in what he said to justify arresting and executing him. And they gave it their best shot. They tried to manipulate him into compromising his truth. They tried to make the one who is truth speak untruth. But one of the things these passages reveal to us is that the truth is perfect and it's absolute and it can't be overcome. For over 2,000 years, it hasn't wavered. Nothing has impacted our world more than the truth of Jesus Christ. It's been the one unchanging thing that seekers throughout the ages have been able to count on in every circumstance of life. John Harris is a columnist for the British news outlet The Guardian, and he recently wrote an article titled, "How do faithless people like me make sense in this past year of COVID?" He writes about how he checked the no religion box on the census poll not too long ago. And he said that for an hour afterward, I felt a pang of envy that has occasionally surfaced in the past, this time to do with a year of lockdown, the sudden fear of serious illness and death, and the sense of all of it being wholly random and senseless. Was this, I wondered, how religious believers were feeling? Or were they able to give their recent experiences at least a semblance of coherence and meaning? He goes on to say, like millions of other faithless people, I haven't even the flimsiest of narratives to project onto what has happened, nor any vocabulary with which to talk about the profundities of life and death. In the first phase of the pandemic, there were clear signs that a lot of us needed much more. For many of us, life without God has turned out to be life without fellowship and shared meaning in the midst of the most disorientating and debilitating crisis most of us have ever known. What he's saying is that without an absolute truth to hold on to in these unprecedented times, he feels lost and adrift. It all feels random and senseless. There's no meaning or purpose. And yet he rejects what he questions about people of faith. He goes on to say, rediscovering such things need not be a matter of finding God. See, he rejects the idea that faith in God is necessary to find wholeness. He says you don't have to have God to have that. In that, he's wrong. What the world offers us in answer to our questions about life and on our place in it is sinking sand. But we who know the truth of Jesus Christ have an unshakable foundation. We are hard-pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not in despair. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. We're struck down, but we're not destroyed. Knowing the truth of Jesus Christ gives us an absolute, an anchor in the storm, a rock to build upon, something that's solid and unchanging, something that stands up to everything this world throws at us. When life is confusing and conflicting and confounding, we have the infinite, unconditional, unlimited, unrestricted, unfailing, unshakable truth of Jesus Christ. We can lean into it and we can hold on to it. It will never let you down. It will stand as a beacon of the brightest light in your darkest hour. It will be your compass when you've lost your way. It will be your touchstone when things are spinning out of control. So don't let the world lure you away from it. It's the only thing in this world that you can trust to be the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So don't lose sight of it. Don't compromise it. Instead, stand fast, hold firm, keep a tight grip on the truth. Jan Hus wrote this famous phrase, seek truth, hear truth, learn truth, love the truth, speak the truth, hold to the truth, and defend the truth until death. The truth of Jesus Christ is the single most powerful thing in this world. And when you align yourself with it, you stand in the very presence and protection of the Almighty God. And that's a very good place to be. That's a place where the world makes sense. A place where, yes, you can be struck down, but you can't be destroyed. So take up your positions. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will give you. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Go out to face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. Let's pray. Great and very gracious God, I thank you for the firm foundation that you give us in your truth. I know I can't be trusted to walk my faith out, well, just using my own feelings and beliefs and opinions. I need the changing truth of Jesus. And the world needs that too. So I ask that you help all of us here and those listening to stand firm, to hold on to your truth in a world that wants to compromise it. Give us the strength to do that well for the betterment of your kingdom. I ask in the name of truth himself, Jesus Christ. Amen.